Yep.
Great. So normally we do. We have about 60 plus folks on the line, so I think it would probably take too long to go through and have everybody introduce themselves today. So if everybody could do me a favor though, before you speak, if you could just introduce yourself when you do speak, if you unmute yourself. So moving on to the agenda, 1 second here. We'll pull up our agenda for today, or Mina will beat me to it, one of the two. Thank you. So action items from our last meeting there was only one action item, and that was to submit comments on the final draft of the CEFF document. And folks did that, and we're going to go over some of those today, and probably might as well just jump right into those. But before we get started, I did want to just do a quick poll to see if there was anything anyone wanted to add to the agenda today. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Today's meeting probably won't last 2 hours. It'll probably be a shorter meeting, judging by the items we have on the agenda. So we can go ahead and jump right in here, and I'll pull up the presentation we put together to go over the comments that were submitted.
Dan?
Yes.
This is Norman Johns of the Department of Water Resources. I guess given the agenda, I was glancing at it. I did not see a break scheduled in there. And if you feel like we're not going to go way over the 2 hours, I would actually suggest that somewhere in there we try to do a little 5-minute break just for our sanity and collective health.
Yeah. If we extend past 11, we'll take a break.
Sounds good.
Dan, when you share your presentation, remember to share it through the desktop app, not the share PowerPoint option.
Which is the desktop app? Just the standard Teams?
Yeah, because otherwise it won't record the presentation.
Okay, does everybody see the presentation now?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, so primarily today we'll just go over some of the comments we received. We're still working on addressing some of the comments, but we certainly can go over them today. So today we'll walk through they're really split up into two different sections. We have actual comments that have led to edits or clarification we've made to the document itself, and then based on some of the comments we received, we're going to be putting together and including those as frequently asked questions. So this is a list of stakeholders that submitted comments and workgroup participants. We received a total of 213 comments altogether, but these were the entities that did comment on them. And I'll go pretty quickly through here. We'll share this presentation after the meeting if anybody is interested in taking a closer look. So I won't read everybody that submitted comments off. So as I said, over 200 comments. And we'll mainly do editorial changes and frequently asked questions. We're not going to do a formal comment response type document, but of course, the technical team is available to answer any comments or questions that either members are not sure how it was addressed in the document, or if it was addressed, or had any follow-up questions regarding their comment. So 4 main categories of comments that we received. One was consistency of language, The second was the clarity of the document. The third was ease of use for application. And the fourth was others, just kind of the catch-all. And we'll start off by going with over some of the edits and changes that were made in the document. This is just high level here. And I don't know if, as far as tech team members, if you want to present each of these slides or if you would just like me to cover it. It's up to you.
I think you can cover it, Dan. We can be available to answer any questions that might come up, through the discussion.
That sounds good. So one item is I'll kind of go through and roll through these slides, but we can go back and have discussion points on any of these slides after we kind of go through them once. We'll kind of go back through. So the first section was the introduction. We did clarify some text and definition of terms. Also added a statement that, CEFF is not replacing any standard agency requirements, regulatory processes, but it is a document that could be used to help inform those efforts. So the primary, and just to circle back on it, because I think there is a little bit of confusion with what CEFF is and what it's not. CEFF itself is primarily looking at the development of flow criteria, and flow criteria do not have regulatory effect. In order for something to take regulatory effect, the State Water Board would go through its standard rulemaking process of adoption of flow objectives in that setting. And we'll get more into some of those questions later on in the presentation. Also added some clarification on captions and figures, on the figures and tables, and then moved some table locations around to better fit in the text. It's pretty high level there. In section A, we clarified that the ecological management goals will always include the general protection of ecological health and require the maintenance of functions associated with each of the 5 functional flow components. And then in step 4, there were some questions on the metrics, and so clarified how the predicted median in the 10th and 90th percentile values of natural flow metrics are expressed as ecological flow criteria. In section B, we did a little bit more additions. It's clarified that section B is necessary if the management goals, ecological management goals, would not be met by the natural ranges of flow metrics identified in section A. And then also added text that decisions on the conceptual models and tools should be informed by experts and stakeholders through an open and transparent process and approved by a decision maker. So that was one of the things that we tried to put a little bit more information on is when to involve stakeholders, and it's really at the beginning of the process is when you should start that stakeholder outreach and bring people in. There will be higher success of implementation if you start off with stakeholders informing every step. Added text to clarify appropriate performance measures, and then explain that the conceptual models are intended to illustrate flow ecology relationships. The non-flow actions are explored in section C if appropriate, and that step is being taken. And then, so the non-flow actions are not explored in section B. First, you work through section B to develop the flow criteria, and then in section C, you look at the flow criteria and other non-flow actions and uses to determine how best to implement the flow criteria through the balancing process. And then also added a statement that a separate conceptual model is required for each functional flow component addressed in section B. And in section C, we clarified that the management objectives should consider regulatory requirements, but again, CEFF is not intended to ensure regulatory compliance. So as you're going through the process, you should be aware if you're working towards local cooperative solutions or towards voluntary agreements through section C, regulatory requirements and the end goal is something that should be considered during that process. But again, there's a separate action that would happen for it to actually take regulatory effect and that would be determined by each agency's processes. And then also separated discussion of SGMA in the state recycled water policy, expanded sources of alterations section to include authorized diversion and climate change effects, and then added example trade-off analysis. So it might work best potentially, since this is a nice, or well, let's keep going through these. There's only a few more slides left, and then we can have more of an open discussion. So the other section is that we're going to be addressing through frequently asked questions. Some basic categories for the frequently asked questions are clarity of terms and presentations, underline the conceptual approach, modeling and analysis, and implementation challenges. And here, what we're trying to present here is just a list of the general questions that we intend to answer, and at this point would be including in a frequently asked question document. So one of the things that we thought was good to include a little bit more information on is, what does CEFF not do? Also, will the state adopt regional criteria pending development of watershed specific criteria? And again, regional flow criteria, be it regional or local, by at least the state water board, is not typically adopted. The board adopts flow objectives which balance beneficial uses. So the either local or regional flow criteria could be used to inform the flow development process or the flow objective setting process. And then, who are the different players expected to use CEFF, and what types of roles do they play? What kind of subject matter expertise? There were some questions around that, so we'll go ahead and clarify that. And then also, does CEFF tell users how much water has to be left in stream for each functional flow component? And as far as the underlying conceptual approach questions is, what is the difference between functional flows and unimpaired flows? We've gotten a lot of questions on that item, so that would be a good one to address. Does the natural flows database apply in the Bay Delta? And we also had one about whether or not it applies in estuary systems. How does CEFF address non-flow factors such as channel modification, water quality, invasive species, and potential effects of climate change? How does CEFF address knowledge gaps? And then in the modeling and analysis section, we had, and can everybody make sure you're please on mute? We're getting a little feedback. For the modeling and analysis, how are the functional flow metrics modeled? How are the functional flow metric predictions ground truth? What are the model limitations? And that's as far as uncertainty and low flows are across specific stream classes. So how did the functional flow metrics, for example, apply in a perennial versus intermittent versus ephemeral stream channel? How can model sensitivity impact overall outcomes? And then what do the percentile ranges represent, and how should they be interpreted, or how can they be used as guidance? And then for the modeling and analysis continued, does CEFF include an ecological flow bottom line, that it's the minimum functional flows needed to sustain key watershed functions? How is alteration assessed, and what is the basis behind alteration classification? How does a user determine the most appropriate period to represent current flow conditions, and what are the recommended minimum years for the period of record? And then some of the implementation challenge questions that came up was, do we have to use all 5 functional flow components, or can we use only a portion? And then how does Section C relate to agency actions to implement environmental flows? And who has the moral and legal authority to define what is an acceptable balance? So again, just to clarify, Section C is really intended for stakeholders developing voluntary agreements and local cooperative solutions. It's not intended to direct or guide the state water board in any of their decisions or processes that we go through. And implementation challenges continued here. How does the framework consider the intersection of other water management and non-ecosystem needs, including social, cultural, economic? Which section should the stakeholder process be initiated? How should the user construct an ecological flow regime? And then does the framework characterize dry season hydrology as base flow, which is essentially a static flow value maintained throughout summer? What tools should be used when implementing CEFF? Does CEFF provide recommended assessment tools for section B? Recommendations for developing monitoring programs. And another question that we're going to address is, does CEFF provide implementation guidance, like best practices for community and stakeholder involvement, links to sources for technical assistance, and funding sources, or an example implementation plan? And I think for this one, you know, just on a high level, we will have the case studies that will be included that will help provide some of this information, and then really, you know, looking into prior actions that others have taken in doing that research would be the one to how best to address that question. Is it possible to use the ecological flow criteria determined through CEFF during development of groundwater sustainability plans for SGMA compliance? And then there were a number of questions that were specific to the State Water Board regarding regulatory action and compliance. These were questions such as, what does CEFF mean for the State Water Board? There was concern that the framework unlawfully elevates fish and wildlife beneficial uses above all other uses. Again, Section A and Section B of the CEFF document look at developing the flow criteria, which is part of the information used in Section C, or if the State Water Board was developing flow objectives, would be potentially used to inform the balancing, at which point fish and wildlife beneficial uses and other uses of water would all be considered and balanced. So it's not elevating one beneficial use over another. The framework fails to adequately incorporate non-flow measures. And again, non-flow measures come in at Section C as part of the balancing step when you evaluate other uses of beneficial uses of water. And the framework, excuse me, the framework fails to consider the interest of water right holders, and the application of the framework is unclear. And so one of the things that we talked about is probably that there's kind of a two set of frequently asked questions here, and what we'll probably do is do the standard frequently asked questions related to the document itself, and then there's a number of questions that folks had, like on this slide here, and a couple others that the State Water Board will probably just do their own frequently asked questions to help provide some clarity for some of these questions. Okay, and next steps. At this point, we're on schedule to have the final revisions and FAQs ready to go for our next work group meeting in May. And then I think in the next May meeting, everybody will have a action item of homework to identify the next steps for the work group, and kind of a brainstorming session of where we want to go from here, assuming that the final document is all wrapped up in May. Where do you all want to see the work group go? So with that, that's pretty much all the slides we have for today. So I'd like to give an opportunity for the tech team to add any additional comments if they would like.
I think that was a good summary, Dan.
Oh, thank you. So I think we can open it up to questions, and I'm open to do it however folks feel best. We could go back through the slides and just see if there's any questions as we go, if that's easiest, or we could just field questions and flip back and forth.
Dan, this is, and everybody else, this is Norman Johns with the Department of Water Resources. I will say I am impressed by I guess, the number of comments that were received, but also the members who have obviously taken this very seriously, and just a lot of effort just to kind of figure out a path forward. And I think the two-pronged approach that you've outlined here sounds like a very positive development. I look forward to seeing the next draft.
Thank you. And maybe it would be helpful to facilitate comments if we just kind of go through the different slides and people can kind of look at it a little bit, see if they have any questions. So I'm going to flip back through. Okay, I think the summary of changes to the introduction were pretty standard, but does anybody have any questions on this slide? Okay, I'll move to this one, and again, what I'll do is I'll just pause on each one for a minute or so, and if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and chime in.
Dan?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. This is Hua Sung Jin at the State Water Board. I just had a general question or a clarification request in a way to the introduction and overall the document, throughout the document. So there is I think I'm going to focus on the term for the functions, and there is one flow component that's called for the functional flows, and then which is supposed to be meaning the ecological or geomorphological functions that's related to more of a structural component plus biological functions, which is good. And there is also the sort of a confusing use of the functions in terms of ecosystem functions, and whether the functions and then structural component of the ecosystem should be clearly defined or and then separated out. And sometimes the functions have been used to sort of describe ecological structures, such as densities or biomass changes, and against the actual functions, which normally what we refer in aquatic ecology is the functions are more of, related to the energy flows, such as productivity of certain species, or growth of species over time, or organic matter dynamics or decomposition, things like that. So the separation would be nice.
Hey, this is Sarah Yarnell at UC Davis. Thanks, Jen, for your comments. I went through and reviewed a lot of what you added in there, and I think I appreciate you speaking up. This might be an opportunity to clarify a little bit how we presented the functions in the introduction. So a couple things to note would be that the table in particular that lists all the functions with the references is there primarily to provide references to papers in the existing literature that do directly discuss and link various functions to flow metrics. So it's not meant to be an exhaustive list of every function that could happen geomorphically, ecologically, biogeochemically within the system, but rather to provide a list of references where there are particular studies that link those various actions and processes to flow metrics. So we did go through and try to clarify what that table was in the caption and try to explain that a little bit better. And then also which maybe should go into an FAQ, but the idea is that we're sort of looking at ecology holistically, where ecological could include and should include that bigger picture of geomorphology, biogeochemistry, and biology. So not limiting ecological functioning to just for example, primary productivity, but kind of recognizing that ecology as a whole encompasses all of those different sort of biological, geomorphological, biogeochemical functions together. So I just wanted to comment that we appreciated the comments on that and have hopefully updated things in the document to be a little bit more clear about what we're discussing and representing within the document.
Yeah, sorry, I guess I was dissecting a little bit too much, but yeah, I look forward to see the further clarification on the table. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thanks for providing the comments.
This is Vivian Hallowell with PCFFA, Fishermen's Group, and North Coast Streamflow Coalition. The question is, do the natural ranges of flow metrics or the flow metrics that are, does this process recommend minimum stream flows? And my main frame of reference is for fish, that is salmonids. I know that might seem simplistic, but this is a complex analysis, and I need a little bit more summary of it.
Yeah, so, and any of the tech team members can jump in and add anything. So the CEFF document, what the natural flow metrics are a range of flows that basically have historically been in the system, and those are intended to be protective of fisheries. However, if the system has been modified, you know, such as it might be incised or other kind of non-natural, non-flow related changes to the system, then you move through section B to start to identify those flows. But it doesn't say that, it doesn't come out, and it's not intended to say that this is the bare minimum flow that is needed for fishery survival, if that is your question.
Yes, thank you.
Can we just jump in?
Yeah, please.
Hi, this is Conrad with Water Climate Trust, and this is an amazing amount of work, probably the most comprehensive methodology of its kind. So kudos to everyone who has been involved. And because it is so comprehensive and has such potential, I and the people I work with would really love to see this result in in-stream flows to the greatest extent possible. And there are reasons previous in-stream flow studies have not resulted in in-stream flow in actual water in rivers. And I would argue that is because the word that the in-stream flows were not basically set to quantify what is required by law. So it doesn't have to be political. You don't have to say this ultimate result is going to comply with XYZ law, but at least using the language of the, say, the Endangered Species Act, like recovery, or the language of 5937. But explicitly avoiding those means that ultimately they can't be used in regulation. And so I guess I'm wondering is, I heard Dan say, but is that definitely the intent, is to only guide voluntary solutions and to not guide regulations or not even enable regulation? And if that is the if that is the overall goal, is that do we have to go that route? Is that required?
So this is Dan Schultz, and no, that was misheard a little bit, I think. The section C of the California Environmental Flows Framework is intended to help water managers work through the balancing process at a local level or with local stakeholders. The information in section C is not intended to guide the State Water Board through its regulatory process or shortcut the State Water Board's regulatory process or anything else. The State Water Board and each agency has a separate regulatory process that they would follow as part of it. Section A and Section B can help inform those processes. Does that answer the question?
Okay, so say that everyone involved with this got through section A and B, and then everything was done minus C. Would then either a public interest organization or someone at the State Water Board working on a water rights issue be able to extrapolate from section A and B flow levels necessary to comply with endangered species recovery, for example, or flow levels necessary to avoid adverse impact to public trust resources? Would it be possible after section A and B were completed for someone to extrapolate those numbers, thereby upholding public interest laws?
Yes, there's the balancing step within there as well, depending on the application and the agency. But yes, that information could be used to take that next step. But the CEFF document doesn't. I just want to be clear because there was confusion on it. So when you move into that next step, a local entity could move through section C and more like a voluntary local cooperative type solution, or it would move over into if it was for a flow objective setting, then it would move over into the State Water Board standard regulatory process and follow that process of either policy or regulation development.
And so, Conrad, this is Eric Stein, and and thanks for your comments. I worked on addressing some of the comments that you specifically provided. And I think the only thing I would add is, as Dan said, because the CEFF framework is intended to be able to apply to a lot of different applications, regulatory and non-regulatory. It doesn't use the specific language of any given regulatory program. But to answer your specific question, I think that at the end of section B, you have a set of functional flow ranges that should be broadly protective of the ecology of the stream overall, including any sensitive species. Now, clearly, if you have, there may be certain species that have more specific requirements in terms of either recovery or other management. And so it's possible, we envision that as you continue to kind of work through the balancing project, those ranges that are broadly protected of the ecology, they may need to be narrowed, for example, or there may be certain additional considerations for, say, dry years versus wet years that you might want to contemplate that are specific for an individual sensitive species, for example, that would further elaborate on those. So it's out of the box at the end of section B. The general ecology should be protected, but there may be additional requirements that might be necessary to protect a given species or use. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Dan.
Okay, so I just pulled the presentation back up. I'm going to continue working through it.
This is John Rubin. I have a question regarding the prior slide. And
yeah, go ahead.
I'm not a biologist and haven't spent as much time as I probably should reviewing the work product here. But can you help me understand the relationship between sections A and B and C? And specifically, my question goes to my thought, and I could be wrong again because I'm not a biologist, but the relationship or the curative nature of flow and non-flow, that the ability to determine whether flows are providing function may relate or do relate to non-flow actions, particularly in a highly altered system.
Yeah, sure. Does one of the tech team want to address that?
Yeah, this is Eric. I could take. I'm not sure I 100% understand the question.
Let me try to just be clearer. Then, if I understood the presentation, the work group worked through section A and B effectively, and then used the information there to identify a range of flows that provide the function, and then set forth non-flow actions in section C. And I was wondering if that approach can be explained. And again, I could be wrong here, but because it seemed my thinking has been there's a much closer relationship in highly altered systems between flow and non-flow in order to determine whether flow can provide biological function.
Yeah, so I can try to start, and then I know Julie Zimmerman is on the phone. She may be able to jump in as well. But in section B, so for sure in highly altered systems, let's just say, for example, the stream has been channelized, and so there's no longer a connection to the floodplain. That's a pretty straightforward example, which is common in altered systems. So that physical alteration and how that affects the decisions about ecological flow criteria, that would be something that initially would be considered in section B, because in section B is where you would think about the specifics of your situation and say, given the physical alteration, we may need to have additional information about the flow criteria, or we may need to realign those flow criteria a little bit to account for that physical alteration. In section C is where you would, if there's other what we call non-ecological concerns, such as say flood control, protection of property through flood control, or say other water use issues that would need to be considered in terms of making an ultimate decision. That is in section C. We sort of lay out a more general approach for how to walk through that process and say, are there things, there's a whole variety of things that could be done, right? That there could be physical modification, stream restoration, there can be retention and detention in the watershed, there could just be physical habitat, restoration. So there's a whole variety of actions you might contemplate, with the goal being that you want to try to always get as close as you possibly can to the ecological flow criteria, while still accommodating the other uses, knowing that you may not always be able to fully meet all of those ecological flow criteria, but your goal is always to try to get there as close as you can. And if you can't actually make it there because there's other constraints on the landscape or other demands, then you would consider, are there other sort of compensatory actions you might take in order to improve the functions that aren't fully met because you're not able to fully get to the ecological flow criteria. So the answer to your question is partly dealt with in section B and partly dealt with in section C, where B is more looking at just the sort of physical biological structure of the system and how that affects your decisions. And then section C is more looking at sort of the non-ecological issues that need to be considered as well. So I'm not sure if that helps, or if Julie wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, sure. This is Julie. I think that's a good explanation. I look at it as section B tells you what you would have to do in terms of flow to meet ecological function. And then section C is where you look at, okay, what could I actually implement? And then what are the trade-offs of using flow versus doing maybe habitat restoration or some other action? That's where you actually evaluate different alternative approaches to achieving ecological function. But A and B are flow only. So in B, you're creating that conceptual model to say, okay, here I'm in a watershed that has a modified channel. Maybe it it, the high flow pulses aren't getting out onto the floodplain, so I don't have as much rearing habitat as I need. For example, I would have to add a lot more flow to get it out on the floodplain and create that rearing habitat than would be a natural flood pulse, maybe. So that's, a hypothetical example. So then you change your criteria to say, okay, here's what it would actually take to create that rearing habitat. And then in section C, you say, well, that's, a lot of water. It's more than would have been there under natural conditions, maybe. And so what if I did some habitat restoration and looked at, lowering the flow criteria, but adding this non-flow action, and you just evaluate the outcomes.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
Do we have any other questions or comments at this point?
Hi there. This is Amber. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Amber
Can you
Baylor.
hear you, Amber?
The last slide. I'm the Director of Environmental Compliance for SACWA. Can you go back to the last slide, please? One more, yeah. So can you talk about that a little bit more, about your separate discussion on Sigma and the state water recycle policy?
Yeah, Amber, this is Eric again. I think that was just, there was a comment that there was just a couple of bullet points in the opening sections of section C where we had dealt with Sigma and the state recycled water policy under a single bullet point, kind of join them as a common consideration. And there was just a comment that said the considerations under Sigma and the considerations under the state recycled water policy are distinct. And so you should just separate those two and kind of make sure that people understand they should be dealt with sort of independently and not co-joined. So it was just more of a clarification based on one of the comments that was submitted.
Oh, okay, so you guys didn't go in and actually have some type of, because it seems to be a consistent theme throughout related to kind of the, what the model can and can't do, and then the separate regulatory, structures related to these flows and the water code considerations. So there was no further articulation related to for example, the recycle water policy.
No, it's just a statement that these are things that should, when you're going through that trade-off analysis, these are things that have to be considered, but without any elaboration.
Okay. Is there any consideration related to, this seems to be the next iteration of this within a framework in the state, or is there any considerations of further analysis, or this will just be the final product? Because I thought I heard throughout the presentation that there was consideration for the next work group meeting, and I'm just trying to understand the potential scope or additional additions moving forward.
Do you want to take that, Dan?
Hi, this is I'm just to mention that this might be also a good way for some Sandoval from UC Davis. These are good brainstorming ideas for our next session in terms of how to move forward these into other regulatory context, or how this information can be used to support. Yep.
Yeah, and this is Dan Schultz. So we've always kind of envisioned the framework to be a living document that can be updated over time, either by adding additional case studies. We recognize that when going through implementation of, that feedback loop of the implementation feedback of any issues or things that come up when implementing it that we need to circle back and update in the document, as well as kind of additional tools and analysis as well. In the past, Sigma's came up quite a bit about how would you apply it in Sigma basins where they're charged to identify the flows that are needed to be in the stream for connected basins where that impact exists, how to identify those locations, those types of items. So I would say for the next meeting, I would recommend if there are, I think, next steps or additional information that we think would be helpful or useful to flush out and start to work on, either to update CEFF sometime in the future or kind of as an add-on to it, or just in general that you think would be beneficial for the work group as a whole to work on, even outside of CEFF as well. Just kind of, looking at where should the work group go from here.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate that. I think based on that as well, I'm thinking in my mind, some additional decision tree analyses that would kind of show where the tool can be applied related to regulatory frameworks that are consistently referenced throughout the document might be beneficial, especially for somebody who's potentially new that may be trying to understand how it fits within the very complex, regulatory water world that we're all familiar with. So that would be just my suggestion. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm taking notes, so give me just a minute. Okay, so scrolling through now the FAQs. As we kind of go through here, if folks have any specific questions on any of these, please don't hesitate to speak up.
Hi, this is Greg Reese with the Bay Institute, staff hydrologist. And I'm on the phone, so I'm sorry I can't see the slides, but I know we made a comment about restoring conditions versus restoring processes. I was wondering how you handled that. And if that comes up later, I can wait to ask the question again.
This is Sarah Yarnell, UC Davis. Yeah, Greg, we appreciated your comments a lot. I think part of our way to respond to that was to try to go through, particularly in the introduction, and clarify, what do we mean by function? What do we mean by process? Clarify what the purpose of the table is and sort of why we put it in there. And clarifying what we mean by condition, which is a state, right, versus process or function, which is an action. And so hopefully that's been a little bit better addressed. And then additionally in the FAQs, trying to add some clarity with regard to definitions and what we mean by different places. So hopefully we've helped to clarify that a little bit in the next version around. But if not, please, always happy to talk about it further.
Great.
Yeah,
thanks. And I appreciate the effort.
Sorry, Greg, I didn't mean to cut you off. This is Julie. I think I actually addressed your comment, so I just wanted to jump in. I did address that directly in section B when under the consideration of putting together the conceptual models. So the idea behind the conceptual models is that you have a functional flow component and that links to processes most of the time, or some kind of intermediate system states, and then your ultimate kind of the end goal would be an ecological outcome. And I think you made the comment that we should have performance measures for kind of all parts of that conceptual model, which I did put in a statement that is appropriate, I think, as long as everything is linked to an ecological, a management goal that we had in mind would be an ecological outcome. So processes are maybe the thing you can measure, and there's a hypothesis linking it to ecology. Maybe you can measure ecology directly, but just kind of capturing that in there. So yeah, hopefully it's more clear now.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I look forward to seeing the revised document, and I really appreciate all the efforts on this and how you're handling the comments, and sounds good, and it's looking forward to it. Thanks.
This is Vivian. So these questions are frequently asked questions are ones that you're going to try to answer?
Yes, that is correct. And we can always expand on the frequently asked questions over time as well, as more questions come up.
We'll plan to post these on the website with the final document when it's ready.
This is Wasung Jin again. So I have two general questions. First one will be, can everybody hear me? Just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So first one will be so the flows determined by the CEFF flows, CEFF process in this document, and then say if you want to convert that or compare to a percent unimpaired flows for that specific location or stream, how would that be? I mean, that would be general question. So I guess I understand it would be all depending on the location and places and things like that. But let's say a major locations throughout the state might have some sort of idea. It doesn't have to be like a time specific, but either monthly or annual number comparison would be nice to sort of inform the general public and then also agency use as well, if that can be possible. Second one will be in a way, I guess it will be more relevant to the previous questions, but the how much of flow that can be left in the stream. So in my case, would be specific question would be there are a lot of locations in the valley or central valley that the streams or lower elevation locations that I wouldn't say stream flows, but I would not say groundwater diversions, but those locations that has wells close to the stream, it's not actually taking out groundwater much, but it's more of the subsurface flows or mainly surface flows in the stream that can be diverted, thus the water level would be go lower than it's supposed to be because of these shallow well diversions. So in this process, how the CEFF process would actually address that? Say, water will be released from upstream to specific target location based on the process, but water actually reaching to the surface as a measure that the surface flows will be different because of that shallow groundwater divergence. And is there some process to compensate, or if the outcome or the measured flows on the surface flows is not actually reaching to the level that is desired for or in a way to target it for, and what is the sort of a recourse or the revising process for that? So hopefully it's not making too much complicated, but those two will be informative. Thanks.
Hi, this is Ted Grantham. I can maybe start by answering or addressing the first question, and maybe it may also in part address the second. In comparing recommendations or environmental flow criteria from CEFF with unimpaired flows, it's one could compare the natural unimpaired flows from Section A, or the natural functional flows from Section A with unimpaired flow estimates from a system. But we've realized that in practice, those natural flows are not really appropriate for developing environmental flow criteria in places like the Central Valley, where the unimpaired flows policy is being developed because of the habitat modification context. And so one to do, I think, a valid comparison of the environmental flow criteria that are generated through CEFF with the unimpaired flows, one would have to go through section B steps, where you would have to do some sort of site-specific studies to, further sort of refine the environmental flow criteria for each of the functional flow components that account for the local physical habitat modification and potentially other limiting factors. So it's at first glance it seems you could do it quite easily, but then upon sort of further investigation, CEFF actually would require that you go through section B to be able to do that comparison. And I think that also applies to your second question, where you have sort of other influences on the hydrology and groundwater surface water interactions. If you had, say, a location of interest in the valley where there are significant groundwater surface water interactions and pumping that's not accounted for in section A, you would need to develop a site-specific model that would account for those dynamics. So I think you would be required to move into this sort of more, I guess, sort of intensive study to address that. Although I would say generally we're certainly interested in sort of maybe the next phase of this work to look at more closely how CEFF applies in the context of SIGMA implementation.
Thanks, Ted. Just say follow up on the first question. My main idea of that question was if you go through the SEP process of all 5 steps and then you say make some sort of flow recommendations, how comparable that will be in terms of a percent unimpaired flows? I guess that was the main question.
Yeah. So I mean, I think one could take the recommendations, the environmental flow recommendations that are established at the end of the CEFF process in section C, and basically use those recommendations to create a hydrograph for representing what the environmental flow recommendations would be on an annual basis, and that would then give you make it possible to sort of back calculate a volume of water on a monthly or even shorter scale basis that then could be compared with with hydrographs or environmental flow recommendations that would be associated with the unimpaired flows approach.
Will the SEP document sort of try to say get an example at the end, or I know it's all
yeah, no, that's something that I mean we're working on case studies, and maybe I don't know if there are others in the team that could elaborate on any places where we could actually maybe provide an illustration of what this particular context. I mean, so much of section C is sort of done at this like relatively high level because we realize that ultimately there's going to be a lot of site specific management considerations and conditions that are going to dictate what the ultimate environmental flow implementation looks like, and so it's a little difficult to generalize. But we are working on a series of case studies that I think may in part address that that need to do that more explicit comparison. Does anybody else from the tech team have any ideas, or more explicit ideas on where the case studies might be that might be helpful for this issue?
I think that one thing that's helpful to realize is that it will look different everywhere, because once you go through section C, the balancing depends on the context of why you're setting flow criteria and what the regulatory context is and who the decision maker is and all those things. So it's never going to be, CEFF comes out on average with this percent of unimpaired. It's meant section C in particular will be applied differently in each location. So I think that's what makes it hard. But yes, the case studies I think will give examples under different, different situations.
I was hoping Eric might jump in here.
Me? I mean, I think I don't really have much to, to add beyond what's, Ted and Julie said. I mean, I think that's, again, it's, the idea is, in section C, that's where, some of the other considerations that you laid out in terms of groundwater management in particular. I know in a lot of places in the state we deal with that, and so that would be considered in section C, and so that may cause you ultimately to have your environmental flow recommendations may sort of deviate from what you got at the end of section B because of those other, and those considerations could be because of the natural, groundwater, function of the system, or it could be because of, groundwater management actions. But it's going to be very location or basin specific. So it's hard to give a general answer, right?
Yeah, thank you all, Eric, Julie, and Ted. And I was hoping more, I guess in a way, I guess you talked about the case studies, and that will be sort of really informative for everybody here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the case studies will be helpful because it's, when you actually start to work through these things in specific locations, that's when it sort of becomes real. And again, I think we have to be careful that the outcome of a given case study won't be something that's universally applicable, but it'll at least provide some illustrations of how the process was implemented under a certain circumstance.
And this is Dan, and I would just add the clarification that everyone touched on it, that if you were to go through CEFF and say compare it to an unimpaired flow recommendation or figure out what that unimpaired flow recommendation is, the most important thing if you were doing that is just to be clear what you're comparing it to. So you wouldn't want to go through section B and compare flow criteria to a balanced environmental flow requirement, because they're not going to line up because the section B doesn't balance the flows. So that's my only caveat is make sure you're comparing the same information against each other if you wanted to do that. But I think from once you have a flow recommendation or you have the flow criteria, whichever step you might be at section B or section C, and you kind of build your hydrograph of recommended flows, from there you can pretty readily just do the calculation to determine if you wanted to compare that to an unimpaired flow amount, a volume or percent of flow in the system. You could do that after you've gone through that step.
Hi, this is Amber. I wanted to talk about that uncertainty in the second bullet point. As far as the uncertainty and the sensitivity, can somebody just maybe articulate a little bit more in detail on, what that means and how that's getting folded in, please?
Sure. This is Ted Grantham, and we describe the model development process and performance evaluation in an appendix to the CEFF document, so those details aren't provided in the body of the document itself. And I guess just sort of quickly how we went through the process. It was so the model that's used to generate these natural flow predictions that then become the basis for developing ecological flow criteria in section A rely on a network of reference flow gauges throughout the state, some contemporary and some historical, for example, gauges that were located at rivers before dams were constructed. And so we train these models with these reference gauge data, and their ground truth, if that's the terminology we want to use, and by training the models with subsets of the data and then making predictions at these at sites that are excluded from model training. And we do this sort of in an iterative way, and that gives us an unbiased estimate of model uncertainty and error. And then for some of these metrics, so we kind of went through several iterations to sort of confirm that these models that predict the natural ranges of values give us sort of reasonable estimates of what we actually observe at these sites. And one of the reasons why we ended up, aggregating these model results at this over sort of long-term averages rather than sort of for specific years is because that it helps us improve. There's more error, I guess, when you try to predict, summer base flow in a particular year versus the range of summer base flows observed over a long period of record. In terms of, I guess uncertainty of specific metrics, some metrics we do better at predicting than others. We are, this is something that we also hope to, have plans to continue to work on and improve at summer base flow predictions in particular. This question about how model sensitivity can impact overall outcomes, I'll just say, that's something that certainly we need to be mindful of, particularly in, in section B, I would say, when we actually start looking at ecological flow relationships to the extent that they incorporate these modeled flow values. But I guess I would also say that because we're in such an early phase of sort of implementation of CEFF, we don't, just in full disclosure, we don't fully, I guess, understand how model uncertainty is going to influence the process, and it's really going to be through the case studies that I think we're going to help to to figure out where we need to really focus energy to address those uncertainties that might be problematic from a management perspective.
Okay, thank you. I think, that pointing to the local identification of some of those sensitivities as you articulated the summer base flows in the Aliso pilot, we can, we are, kind of looking at that in a little bit more detail. I'm sure that Eric can articulate a little bit more, but as far as making sure that those things related to limitations can be, appropriately applied and articulated, maybe within the same, context of a decision tree analysis, so that people can understand how these tools are really being utilized or can be utilized, I think is really helpful and a key lesson learned. I think that we're starting to realize a little bit more. So I look forward to more of that information in the appendix related to the case study application, because it does have very large range implication related to further analyses for that coupling of those ecological components that I think should definitely be highlighted. As you said, this is a very new tool, and so I just want to make sure that we understand, or that it's in there, that the kind of the potential limitations as well. So thank you.
Okay. No, thank you.
And then Amber, just to follow up on Amber's comment, in the case study that Amber was referring to, this is Eric again, because we had, and this is an important point, because we had a local watershed model that obviously was calibrated and validated for local watershed conditions, we're able to essentially follow the exact same approach, but the statewide model that Ted was talking about is great because it's available statewide, but it doesn't mean that you have to use the statewide model. You can follow the general approach of CEFF in terms of going through all of the analyses and the 12 steps of the process, but you can use a more, if you have a more precise or more accurate local model, the process is essentially the same. You're just using, more locally calibrated model. And in that particular case study, what we found is that it actually didn't really change our conclusions all that much in terms of how we were prioritizing areas for more analysis, but it just provides a more refined analysis of natural conditions by using the local model. But the process is still exactly the same.
Thanks, Eric.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I have 11:15, just about. So why don't we go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break, meet back at 11:20. And I'll keep kind of just scrolling through the slides while everybody's on break, and you can continue to take a look at them. Okay, we can go ahead and get started back up here. Did anybody have any more questions or comments on the FAQs or the updates to the document?
Dan, this is Norman Johns with DWR again. I had a question. I should have brought this up on an earlier slide. Could you go back to maybe back up a couple slides? It was more in the computational area. I think one of your, one more, I believe. Should have brought this up earlier. And Ted and Eric kind of alluded to this a little bit when they were talking about site-specific information being brought to bear in the process. And maybe my comment on maybe all it requires is some kind of clarification in a definitions section, which I think you alluded to is going to be added. But in many parts of the state, we pretty much consider unimpaired flows equal to natural flows, and it's the natural flows which are actually fundamental to the derivation of the whole functional flow metrics and so on. But unimpaired flows are, as far as from what I can tell, after I've been here about a year, they're kind of a flow statistic of convenience where you take a gauge and you try to correct for human influences on that gauge to try to approximate natural flows. But in many cases, you can't correct for everything, like land use changes. And even in the case of where we have levees, you can't account for, a natural flow pulse would have got out on that floodplain, recharged the floodplain, and then like a sponge released the flows more slowly back to the stream. So there would be a difference between unimpaired flows and natural flows just because of the processes that you're able to correct for with kind of normal level of convenience. So there's always the possibility of bringing more detailed information to bear. And I just want to make sure that maybe, like I say, just in a definitions section or something like that, that there's maybe just a minimal description of how these can be different depending on the location.
Hi, this is Sam Sandoval from UC Davis. Yeah, we address this in a frequently asked question, and yeah, the answer is that the functional were the reference gauges, and then they were.
Sam, you're cutting in and out.
Oh, sorry.
Not hearing you at all, Sam.
Yeah, sorry, Sam, we can't hear you. This is Ted, Norman, and I guess the points that you raise are one that have been raised several times by reviewers, and is certainly a source of some confusion. And so, I'm not sure to the extent to which we're addressing we certainly provide definitions in the CEFF document, but I think the motivation behind providing the specific topic in the FAQ is to address that very source of confusion, to make sure that we're clearly distinguishing what we consider to be natural flows or natural functional flows from unimpaired flows and full natural flows that are used in the context of DWR and other planning processes. But
yeah, I think now I can. People can hear me. Sam Sandoval from UC Davis. Yeah, we put together the team frequently asked questions for that, and I think the short answer is that we're put a table and what are the specific distinctions between these unimpaired flows that, as you're mentioning, Norm.
Sounds good.
Are back calculated, and these
You're still cutting in and out, Sam.
No, yeah, no, that was it. One thing that I have seen that Andy has his hand raised for a long time. I just want to if he can unmute and talk.
I'm waiting for you to finish. This is Andy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So can I ask a question? Kind of new to this, so bear with me. Here's my question. How does the statewide classification of California water bodies per their highest, best, and most beneficial and reasonable use per Article 10, Section 2 of the California Constitution apply here? And I have an example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, example
which is the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1972. I'm quoting from the language in the Public Resources Code, Division 5, Chapter 1.4, under pertinent excerpts from the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that was incorporated into the Forest Practice Act in 1973. And I'd like to just read the first sentence of it. It's a policy of the state, the legislative declaration under section 5093.50. It is a policy of the state of California that certain rivers which possess extraordinary scenic, recreational, fishery, or wildlife values shall be preserved in their free-flowing state, together with their immediate environments, for the benefit and enjoyment of the people of the state. The legislature declares that such use of these rivers is the highest and most beneficial use and is a reasonable and beneficial use of water within the meaning of Section 2 of Article 10 of the California Constitution. It is the purpose of this chapter to create a wild and scenic river system to be administered in accordance with the provisions of this chapter. And there's a lot more that goes after that, but
so this is Dan Schultz, in that situation with the wild and scenic rivers, I would actually have to look back and research how they're established. I don't know that process off the top of my head. But as far as looking at other beneficial uses of water, both from a use standpoint and an in-stream standpoint, those would be balanced and handled through the, like, for example, the water board's objectives, water quality objective setting process would be how those would get established. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if I'm hitting it.
Well, I can tell that you're trying, but I don't know that it's a definitive answer. They have a series of definitions. If you look up this Public Resource Code, Division 5, Chapter 1.4, you'll have it all laid out for you, because the section that I just quoted follows with definitions, another section right after that, and components of the system, which includes the following rivers and segments thereof are designated as components of the system. And it goes on to list a lot of them, which are in the North Coast region, and they are groundwater dependent largely, and they're interconnected. The Klamath, the Scott, the Salmon, Woolly Creek, the Trinity, the Smith, and so on. So they need special consideration when you're trying to consider past use, damage to the system so far, dams, all kinds of stuff has to be incorporated in your thinking when you're trying to do what you're doing here, it seems to me. The underlying conceptual approach has to bear these things in mind. If it's a domestic water use as the highest and best use, that may be on the same watershed as a fish habitat situation or a mining situation. So they have special treatment areas delineated in the act itself, which describe what kind of special considerations in land use, whether it's timber harvesting or what have you, that could affect the quality and quantity of these habitats. and in wild and scenic.
Hi, this is Bronwyn Stanford from Fish and Wildlife. And I guess I would just, one thing we did try to clarify, I think these are great concerns. And I think one thing we did really work to clarify in some of the FAQs and some of the language in the document is nothing in this CEFF process undermines any existing laws or existing authorities. So if there are like in the case of the wild and scenic rivers, like there's nothing in CEFF that would say like, oh, well, now we're going to just like balance you with other uses or something like that. Like all of the existing regulations and guidance for the type of system and the type of beneficial use that would be considered there, those are still in place. This is just really a tool to help people think about like ways to manage, ways to set flows for their system. I don't know if that helps, but just to assuage any concerns that this is somehow going to change the way that we're thinking about beneficial uses or the use of water in these systems that already do have existing specific rules applying to them. Like that is certainly not what is going to happen under CEFF.
This is Greg Reese with the Bay Institute. I might be able to help clarify something too. The public trust generally needs to be protected as far as feasible, and the Water Board balances that with other beneficial uses. But there are instances where the legislature has done the balancing already. In 5937, maintaining fish in good condition below dams is one example where the legislature has done the balancing already. And I think wild and scenic sounds like it falls into that same category.
Hello? Hello?
Yes.
The problem becomes when you have a situation like the Scott, such as the Scott, which has wild and scenic river segments delineated in the act that I just quoted from, and feeding into the Klamath system, the main stem, which is under the system, that the other uses in that same watershed, the larger stream system of the Scott, includes a lot of other land use activities that are somewhat antithetical to fisheries, and they're in practice now, whether it's pot diversions or anything else, cattle, alfalfa, what have you. And now they're growing hogs up there, and so they have hazardous waste problems that are really severe. You can't compost hog poop, and it can affect, if it's a storage area in a pond, it can seep into a river system and in the groundwater and come back up and affect the fisheries values and everything else that's in there, algae production, what have you, with too many nitrates. So it seems to me you have a real problem here if you're trying to separate these sub-uses and sub-criteria out. You have almost a constitutional crisis if you look at it that way, because they're all covered under the different uses under this Article 10, Section 2.
So you can still have diversions of water for other beneficial uses in wild and scenic streams if they existed before that stream was designated as wild and scenic. And in some situations, you can still get a water right in those systems as well, a new water right. So the CEFF document looks at trying to address the question of how much flow is needed in the system to be protective of ecological in-stream flow needs. Section C of the CEFF document goes into a little bit about balancing that with other beneficial uses, but that's going to be a little bit more of a local decision making, and when you're going through that phase, that's where we tried to add in that component that people should be considering the regulatory outcomes or how the regulatory nexus applies in that system as they go through it. For the Water Board, when we go through the objective setting process, that's typically a relatively standard process that we move through to do the balancing of other beneficial uses in compliance with the Water Code and Article 10 and all other code, applicable code sections. And I'm not sure we're quite addressing the question, but I think part of it is that CEFF doesn't get to that end by itself. That was something we have heard as part of the feedback was, adding more clarification and more information in section C, part of that balancing and evaluating other non-water uses. And that might be something that there's opportunities for in the future after some implementation and some review of some of the pilot projects and studies, case studies. Any other questions or comments?
This is Margaret Tauser. I kind of coming from the other end of that discussion. It seems like I didn't really hear, but maybe you said it earlier that whether you're going to be considering adding any more functions, instead of just the 5 functions that you've done, to better describe, in places where we have less disturbance, a better, summary of what the hydrology should look like. You had mentioned that you couldn't really look at year-to-year variation, but, it happens to be what the fish really care about. And, whether it's a dry year or wetter year, and so it'd be really great if you're able to add a little bit more functions to hydrograph. And I'm not sure if you were going to address that in your comments, or it was partly part of NIM's comments to the water board on that.
Hey, this is Sarah Yarnell again. Yeah, I think that what we've been a little bit struggling with definitions is kind of what do we mean by these different things, like when we use the word functions. So the 5 functional flow components are really referring to, the various seasonal aspects of the hydrograph, and there's variation within, for example, the summer base flow. Wet seasons are going to have a higher summer base flow. Wet years are going to have a higher summer base flow, for example, than dry years. And so that's partly why we, focus on the range and include that variability. You could take the results of the functional flow metrics and parse them out by water year type to get a little bit more distinction and quantification of that variability through time, which is incredibly important, as you point out, for our stream systems here in California. And then versus saying that, like a particular function is going to be met within a particular component or aspect of the hydrograph. And then there's a lot of different processes then that are related to that seasonal time of flow. And so I hope that in the revisions, we've tried to be a little bit more distinct in terms of defining what we mean by those and trying to make sure that we're being consistent about which terms we're using in which places. And so I hope that helps. But the idea behind quantifying the functional flow components is that you're able to put numbers on those aspects of the hydrograph that we know support the various processes that are happening within the channel. So in terms of adding more, and maybe if what we put out with the FAQs and the document is still unclear, then we can add to the FAQs to try to help better distinguish that. And I think going through some of the case studies will also help show a little bit about how those definitions are. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but yeah, I appreciate the comments and hope that we can be a little better about our definitions and terms in the document that might help these uncertainties.
Yeah, and so it may be that you will answer them because I can't, not understanding it fully, but I guess it seemed like there are some streams that are fairly unimpaired. So, it would be another approach kind of to try to put functions that define all of that, like multiple storms during the year. like how frequent they should be. I mean, it seems to me it could be possible to, define if we really were protecting this for fisheries, we would have many storms, moderate storms, medium storms, not just the peak flow and then the base flow.
Right. Well, and that's exactly why we call out the 2-year flood, the 5-year flood, and the 10-year flood, right? So those would be representative of different types of peak flow or flood flow events that are important.
Yeah, and I saw that.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm more concerned is with the annual variability and also the flow reception, like in the summer, not just the base flow, because we've seen how base flow, works. Right. You set that limit, then it keeps receding, but putting it towards the end of the season.
Right, and that was another comment that somebody brought up, regarding the definition of base flow. Base flow in sun systems that are groundwater dominated might be very flat through the summer, but in the North Coast streams that are where the base flow is coming from contributions of shallow subsurface flow, that base flow continues to decline into the summer. And so that's exactly the type of adjustment that you would want to take into account, when you're working through Section B for your local systems. So it's not that base flow isn't important, but how base flow is defined and what base flow looks like in the different systems might be slightly different, exactly as you're saying. So, you wouldn't then obviously want to, suggest an entire single base flow value, for example, for 7 months out of the year, knowing you would never be able to achieve it in the second half of the summer if your system is not, really have a strong groundwater component that holds that base flow constant into the summer. So yeah, those are good points, and I think we've been able to address quite a few of those through the FAQs. So
okay, thanks.
And is the functional flow calculator set up to allow you to evaluate the metrics by like drier years and categorize them?
Yes, you would. Right. So the predictions, and Ted can looks like Ted dropped off. Julie could jump in regarding the natural flows database, but the predictions are based out by water year type, dry, moderate, or wet. So you do have ranges of predictions for the different water year types across the, based on the statistical models. And then if you yourself wanted to go through and run the calculator and calculate flows for your local system, for example, you would just need to go through and say I have a flow record from 1980 to 2000, and then go back and say, you could parse out, the calculator will calculate what the metrics are for every year of that flow record, and then you could go through and group them by water year type. So if you knew that in your system, 83 was a wet year, you could pull out all of the wet years and calculate and look at that distribution of functional flow metrics by water year type, which would really, be helpful. We don't walk through it in the CEFF document as an example, but I think I know at least in a couple of the case studies, we are doing exactly that to look at that water year typing analysis. So those examples will be out there eventually.
Yeah, that is correct. And yeah, there are some guidance also for using either the functional flows calculator and also to download data. Mm-hmm.
And then that kind of ties into a question here in chat regarding how does the impending predictions of climate change for drier, warmer years and bigger storm events get calculated? And so I would add on that if you have modeled flows of what's going to happen under climate change scenarios, you could put those flows into the functional flow calculator and explore how it will impact the metrics as part of that comparison. Other than that, we kind of consider that as part of Section C, the climate change component of really looking at, well, how will these flows be implemented and how are we going to monitor success? And through adaptive management, circling back to make adjustments when needed. I don't know if the rest of the team has anything to add to that.
That is correct, Sam Sando from UC Davis. And also I think So yeah, one is the tools that are already there for everyone to use. And you mentioned one, the functional flows calculator. If you have daily time series data considering climate change, weather, that will
I think Sam, your audio isn't working again, but I'll just say, Dan, exactly what you said in our San Juan Aliso case study. That's exactly, we dealt with it exactly like you said. We took the downscale climate precipitation predictions and ran them back through
and model data out of it.
And looked at how it affected the functional flow metrics into the future. And in some cases, it moved the functional flows closer to natural. In some cases, it moved them a little further away, right? So.
That will be fun. Use it. Now, can you hear me? Hello?
No, Sam, you're cutting in and out, Sam. We can't really hear you that well.
Okay, so I have 11:45. So just doing a time check here. Are there any other questions before we move on to a quick update on the LA River effort? Okay, I'm hearing none. And at any point, you can feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions. So I will turn it over to Eric to give an update.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I think in the interest of time, I had a few slides that I put together, but actually I think in the interest of time, I'll just confine this to a quick verbal update, and we can forego the slides just so we can wrap on time. And it was just, I think, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, but the reason we put this on the agenda is just because this is an example of an instance where we're applying the CEFF approach in a highly urbanized system, which is the LA River watershed, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with the level of urbanization in the Los Angeles region. And this is really to help support some decision making around a request to reduce treated wastewater discharge into the LA River for recycling purposes, and also to evaluate the effect of reduced storm drain discharge that is part of the MS4 permit, which requires the municipalities to reduce their dry season discharge. And so I just put this on here because we've been working on this project for several years. We are actually about to come out with our the sort of final recommendations report within about a month. And so I think it's an interesting example of sort of how to work through some of these issues in a very urban setting with lots of other competing demands, such as water quality, flood control, and water reuse. And so I'll probably just leave it at that to say that we do have a technical advisory committee meeting coming up on February 26th of this month. It's a Friday, where we'll be presenting those recommendations. The State Water Board, if you just go to the State Water Board and look up Los Angeles River Flows Project, they have a web page. And so if you're interested, there's links on there if you wanted to sit in and listen on that. We'll be going through some of those recommendations at the February 26th meeting, and then probably have our final report out, sometime in the March timeframe. And I'm happy to provide a more detailed update at a subsequent meeting of this group, but I'll leave it at that given the time constraints for today, Dan.
Great, thank you, Eric. So that's pretty much all we had on the agenda for today. So does anybody have any potential topics they'd like to add for our next meeting? And if you do come up with any, you can always shoot me an email and we can get them incorporated in the next agenda.
Yeah, and I think Dan, Sam put some in the chat that came up earlier in the meeting.
Oh, great.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me? This is Andy again.
Yes, we can hear you.
Some cohorts and I have been entertaining the idea of offering an amendment to Sigma to include the Wild and Scenic River System protections in it as part of the act, similar to the way the legislature adopted the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act for the state of California in '72, adopted it into the 1973 Forest Practice Act. And in 1980, the Siskiyou County Superior Court, in adjudicating the different water rights contentions on the Scott stream system, included the amendment to that decree, the adjudication called the decree, to include under Article 3 the protections of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of California from 1972. So there's two precedents for other legislation to include the Wild and Scenic River protections in it. So it seems to me that, and to us, that Sigma may just lack the statement that would include those protections officially, as did the other two pieces of legislation, or the decree rather, that would cement those protections in there. So when it comes up to disputing what use prevails or should, there's some clarity there. One example of that is in the Scott system, as Felice noted in the sidebar, the ag uses are predominant above the segment that was listed under Wild and Scenic from Shackleford to the mouth where it meets the Klamath. But that system alone is affected by the ag uses above it. And that's not being considered unless they're adjacent to it, which they really are when you consider how much stuff is getting poured into that system by the time it gets down to Shackleford Creek mouth. And within Shackleford Creek itself, there's two items of note there. One is that there's forest practices going on upstream on Shackleford watershed that affects the water quality and quantity coming into that mouth and into the system. And the other one slips my mind right now. But those are worth considering operationally when you're trying to figure out how to conduct the other parts of your your setup here and determining stream flows and all of that. And I don't see how you can get around it eventually. You know what I mean? Just food for thought.
Thank you.
Dan, this is Norman Johns of DWR again. Could you refresh my memory on the timetable for the revision to the CEFF and the FAQ inclusion and so on vis-a-vis the next meeting in May? I mean, would that be a rollout opportunity to kind of walk through it, or is it going to be out well before that? I'm thinking about
we're targeting it. Yeah, we're targeting to have everything complete by next meeting.
But not necessarily, we wouldn't have necessarily have laid eyes upon it before the next meeting.
If we get it done earlier and it's ready to go, we'll share it before the meeting.
Well, what I guess I'm driving at on the potential topics is sort of, it depends is the answer. If the document's been out well before the next meeting, it would obviously be maybe some reaction to it. But if it's not out well before the meeting, then that makes that not a good topic. So I was just exploring timetables there. And I don't know what to propose on potential topics because it really depends on, the rollout and the time frame available to look at it and react to it.
Yeah, and we can play that by ear and just have a tentative item to circle back and discuss the CEFF document. And if it's not out earlier than the meeting, then that's something that we can circle back at future meetings too.
So is it okay to ask another question here?
Yes.
Okay. The other part that I forgot was that the DWR on Shackleford Creek that feeds into and it's under the Wildwood Scenic Rivers part of the Scott has a water master agreement, which they are authorized to establish and to run, to govern or to monitor water use on the Shackleford system. So that's a big plus. But that brings up another question that a lot of us are trying to figure out here. The DWR runs the idea of the water master and other parts, and they're doing integrated watershed management as part of their mandate. Where does that leave off? And the state water board and the regional water boards begin and leave off, and the county superior court delineations, and so on. How do they fit together? It seems to me that the regulatory framework has a problem built into it, overlapping jurisdictions that confuse the issue operationally when we're trying to appeal a timber harvest plan or some other action that's going on a particular stream system. And it would really help if you could clarify how these agencies interact and where one leaves off and the other begins, so we could understand how to play this game for real. Thank you.
Yeah, and so I think to summarize that comment, you're looking to have better clarity of how the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and State Water Board, like say policies for in-stream flows or water use and other water rights, how they interact together and how they overlap.
Correct.
Yeah, so I believe a few meetings back, we've had some presentations on Sigma as an overview. And I don't know if we still have some of those presentations posted, but we can see if I have them up on the website. I don't know if we'll go back to having another presentation on Sigma and having people that work in Sigma come in and present. But I think we can probably, if you want to shoot me an email, I can pass you on to the Sigma teams.
Okay.
I don't directly.
Do you have an address of some sort that you can put on the screen or text me or whatever?
Yeah, I'll put it up here in chat.
Okay, thank you.
And it looks like the presentation that we had also is up in the chat as well, if you want to go to the link.
Please repeat that.
Yeah, the presentation is also in the chat, the link to it. If you want to click on it, you can see more information there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I have just before noon here, so I think we can go ahead and wrap up the meeting. Our next meeting will be on May 11th. So we'll see you all there. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Dan. Al.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.